بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in a series on Al-Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims. We've been discussing the subsidiary maxims related to the major maxim Al-Mashaqqatu tajlib at-Taysir, and this will be the last episode related to the subsidiaries of this major maxim. And we said that mashaqqa, hardship, is divided into two categories, two levels. Darura is intense necessity, and haja it's a less intense form of necessity, so sometimes translated as need. So the name of this maxim, the topic of today's discussion, is Al-Hajatu tunazzalu manzilat ad-darura, amatan kanat aw khasa. Need, whether general or specific, is treated like darura. It's treated like necessity. So need and necessity, they sound pretty much like the same thing. And actually, in the Arabic language, darura and haja are also synonyms of each other. In the Arabic dictionaries, for definition of darura would be listed as haja or vice versa. And because of that, there is some confusion and some difficulty among Sharia scholars in precisely determining the difference between the two. And so a part of today's discussion will be in the difference between those two. Now, just as a sort of a history of how this maxim developed and appeared across the centuries, the first person to propose it was Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. He was the most famous teacher of Imam al-Ghazali, and the way that he phrased the maxim was that general need is treated like necessity. So he didn't mention special need. And so that brings us to another topic which we'll also be discussing in this session, which is what's the difference? What does it mean, general need and specific need? So, to reiterate once again, technical meanings of haja and darura. Darura is a need which, when it's disrupted, it's not met, then life becomes unbearable. If it happens on a societal level, the society falls into chaos and is totally disrupted. Haja is a need which, if it's not fulfilled, life becomes difficult, and you can still, despite that difficulty, you can still survive, carry on, but life becomes much less pleasant. So now let's talk about the difference between general haja and specific haja, because understanding those terms is very important to understanding the overall concept and how the maxim works. A general haja grants greater leeway to avail of a concession than does a special haja. It's not necessary for a person who makes use of a general haja, a relaxation based upon general haja, it's not necessary for them to demonstrate need. So to give an example of that, there are certain kinds of transactions which are, for one reason or another, anomalous, according to the basic rules of exchange contracts. So an example of that is ijara. Ijara has two types. One is where you hire labor, and the other is where you hire a thing. So hiring a car, hiring a house, in other words, leasing. Those are examples of ijara. So when you pay the money for leasing, let's say, an apartment, it's pretty much universal that you pay up front. Normally when you rent an apartment, you actually have to put down a security deposit and you pay the first month's rent in advance. And then you're allowed to live in that apartment for another month, and then you have to pay again. Okay, so at the time of the payment, what are you paying for exactly? You're paying for usufruct, the use of that apartment. So the usufruct is not all present at the time that you pay the money. It's something that you make use of over a passage of time. So the idea that you're paying for something which you aren't exactly getting full use of at the time of payment, there's many scholars that consider there to be an element of anomaly in this contract. Despite that, it is something that has been permitted by the Sharia. And for a person to make use of this concession, which is a general concession that's open to everybody, he doesn't have to demonstrate that he is in some kind of special need category. Anybody who wants to make use of it can make use of it. Now, if you're in a case of special need, then you have to demonstrate that you're in a situation where you have need. Now, an example of that from the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ prohibited men from wearing silk. But there were certain people who they contracted scabies or something where they had a skin condition where they were itching, and the normal kind of clothing was wool. That's very kind of scratchy. It was difficult for them to bear with the discomfort of wearing wool clothing when they had the skin condition. So the Prophet ﷺ, he allowed them to wear silk. So that was a special concession for them. And anybody coming after them who has that same condition is also allowed to wear silk because of that special need. But that special need doesn't mean that the prohibition has been relaxed for every other man. It's still in place. And just like الضرورة تقدر بقدرها, the same thing with haja. If it's a special haja, then the person should make use of it in proportion to his need. And that restriction doesn't apply to general haja. Okay, now let's take a look at the difference between haja and darura. Like I said before, the two words are considered synonymous when it comes to the linguistic meaning. But as technical terms, there are differences between them, and they have different legal effects. So darura is, first of all, at a higher level of hardship. Haja is at an intermediate level. I mean, it's still given consideration. It's not light level. It's intermediate. As we mentioned in the previous episode, darura is a condition that allows for the overriding of primary prohibition. However, a haja is not strong enough to override a primary prohibition. So we gave the example of a doctor looking at the aura of a patient in order to treat them. So because this is a haja, and because the prohibition of looking at the aura is a secondary prohibition, which is intended to prevent the primary prohibition of zina, then something which is at the level of haja is allowed to override the secondary prohibition. So that's a really important distinction, which, if you understand it, it clarifies confusion about so many issues. And so let's take a break at this point and we'll come back and pick it up. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. Okay, we're talking about the differences between darura and haja and their legal effects. Darura is something that impels a person. It's like constraining circumstances that impel a person to do something that he would not normally choose to do. So this is the motive force of darura. And by contrast, the motive for haja, for seeking a relaxation based on haja, is a desire for facility, a desire for ease. So it's not on the same level of compulsion. Another difference is that the concessions that are brought about by darura and by a specific haja are temporary. They last only as long as the condition lasts. The kind of things that are covered by a general haja, they're valid and available at all times. So they're permanent, they're not temporary. The indicators for when something is at the level of darura are pretty clear-cut. Life-threatening, threatening of, person's limbs or organs, threatening their very livelihood, total loss of their wealth. These kind of issues are major issues. They're fairly clear-cut. Haja is a much more difficult category to pin down, and it's an area where ijtihad is really quite necessary. So that's a difference between the two. Also, darura and specific haja are limited to the person. The concessions that come from them are limited to the person who's going through them. And for a general haja, it's open to use by everybody. Also, there is scholarly consensus that darura makes the prohibited act lawful for the person who uses it. That same consensus does not hold for haja. There's difference of scholarly opinion about that point. Now, there are also conditions that scholars have identified for when specific haja becomes permissible as a reason for relaxing a stringent rule, relaxing a prohibition. As we mentioned, in other situations, the need must be existent, not something that is expected, that this might occur, or you think it probably will occur, but you're not sure. Also, an important distinction with regard to haja as opposed to darura is that when a person takes use of the concession that is afforded by a specific haja, it should not be at the expense of those objectives of the Sharia that are at the level of daruriyat, those essential needs. So making use of a concession to facilitate these intermediate needs should not be at the expense of these higher objectives. With regard to the authority of the maxim, we already mentioned the example of the Prophet ﷺ giving permission to some of his companions to wear silk. Their condition clearly hadn't reached the level of darura. It was at the level of specific haja. An example of general haja, which we mentioned in an earlier episode, but I'll repeat it here because we're speaking about this category in particular, is salam sales. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited people from selling what they don't possess, but that is exactly what happens in a salam sale. The buyer gives the money in the contract session, and the seller agrees to deliver a commodity of a certain specification and specified amount at a specified delivery date. So the price is known, the attributes of the commodity are known, the delivery date is fixed, but the seller doesn't have his hands on the commodity at the time of the contract. So that's an exception to that general rule. And what it is that's being sold is something which is generic in nature. You can't have a sell-em sale like, I'll sell you this horse, which I don't own, this particular horse which just won the Kentucky Derby. I'll sell it to you in a year. I mean, you have no way of knowing that you're going to be able to get a hold of that particular horse. So sell-em sales don't cover that kind of commodity. They're what are called fungible goods. So wheat, you know, there are different varieties, yes, but as long as you have this type of, you know, North Dakota winter wheat, then whether it's from this farmer's farm or that farmer's farm doesn't matter. It fulfills those specifications of the contract. So in that situation, the Prophet ﷺ, he made a general exception. So people in general can make use of this concession, which is a general haja, and no particular person is required to demonstrate that he is in some unusual circumstances in order to be able to use that contract. And Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anh, he mentioned that Ayatul Mudayana, you know, this verse in the Quran, the longest verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, translation, "O you believe, when you contract for obligations at a future date, then write it down." Ibn Abbas, he said, "I swear by Allah that this verse was revealed about sell-em sales." And that narration is recorded by Imam al-Tabari in his tafsir. So there's no difference of opinion among Muslim scholars that sell-em sales are permissible. Now, some of the applications of this rule, this principle that a special or a general haja is treated on a level with darura, we already mentioned the case of riba al-fadl as a basic prohibition, and then the exemption of that is araya sales, where poor people who want to eat fresh dates are allowed to purchase fresh dates by exchanging them for dry dates. Now, although concession is provided by a specific text, and for most general hajas, concessions are provided by specific texts, this specific text mentions specifically that it's for the poor, and so it can't be treated as a general haja. It's those who are allowed to make use of it are the poor. This may seem like a kind of an archaic issue, the issue of photographs. You know, one prominent Saudi scholar who said, you know, this was an issue about which many scholars were very strict in earlier times, and I mean, they only permitted photographs to be used in cases of general necessity. People need driver's licenses, they need passports that have their photo on them. So they allowed an exemption to the those general hadiths that prohibit the fashioning of images on the basis of need. Now, this particular scholar had a clip on YouTube that I was watching, and he said, you know, that that was an issue that people seem to talk about and make an issue at an earlier era, and you don't hear them talking about it that much because it's a case almost of umum al-balwa. Mentioned that one of the things that becomes a cause for concession is when something becomes extremely widespread. And there are other reasons also for believing that there are concessions regarding to that issue, but this isn't the place to go into it in depth. Other examples of this are istisna in Islamic finance, and this is a contract that is anomalous, but it was allowed from the earliest era of Islam. Somebody agrees with a contractor or a manufacturer to make some product, and they work out a payment schedule and a delivery schedule. So at the time of the contract, the good doesn't exist. So in a way, it's like selling something you don't possess. However, there is a general need for that kind of an arrangement. And because of that general need, there's no difference of opinion that I'm aware of regarding the permissibility of that. It's something which is widely allowed. Another anomalous Islamic contract is ju'ala. This means to promise a reward to someone for doing an act, and you only reward them if they complete the act. Now, normally an ijara contract where you hire somebody to do work for you, the work has to be known and the payment has to be known. In ju'ala, the person doesn't know if he's going to get paid or not, because he'll only get paid if he actually does the job completely. And despite the anomalous nature of that contract, there are specific Sharia texts that allow it. Run out of time, so assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
إلهي أنت ربي ذو الجلال علمت بما نويت بلا جدال إلهي قد أتيتك فاعف عني وهذا ذل يغني عن سؤالي.
Oh shaitan, I'm gonna throw you down right into the